So the book of Ruth, Jackie, shows up actually, it's a sort of a wanderer of a book. In our Bibles, it shows up later in the writings. In many Christian Bibles, it shows up much earlier, right? It comes after the book of Judges. Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth. Why?
Well, there's a link that links their place in both of them. So in our Bible, it follows Proverbs, and it does so with a phrase that links them. So Ruth is described as an eshet chayil, right? A woman of valor. And this links up with Proverbs, the last poem that concludes the book of Proverbs, which is the poem of a woman of valor. So that's the nice little link between them, those two works. That's not the principle of arrangement in the Christian Bible. So in the Christian Bible, the arrangement has more to do with linking up personages and historical personages and periods of time. So Ruth is set in the period of the Judges.
Right, that's like the very first line is something like, in the days when the judges were judging.
Right, which is like, can we say that, fan fiction was sort of like slotted in as a kind of fan fiction sequel to the book of Judges? Yes, but it's also a very bizarre kind of fan fiction that really upends the tone of Judges.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you would never read Ruth and be like, oh, this could be in the book of Judges.
Yeah. It actually could not be in the book of Judges.
Why?
Well, so there's a phrase that's repeated over and over again in the book of Judges, which is, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, which is, it sounds good, but it's actually quite bad, right? Like, to do what is right in your own eyes is not what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be following God's commands. So to do what is right in your own eyes means that you engage in all kinds of terrible behavior.
Right.
And such is not the case in the really like saccharine, sweet tone of Ruth, where we have everyone who's seemingly behaving at their absolute best, even in circumstances where one would never expect someone to behave in their absolute best. If we could talk about the threshing floor scene in the middle of the night, you'd expect a lot more bad behavior with, Ruth uncovering the place of Boaz's legs. Translations may vary. But, to say that's part of the tone of the book of Judges really sort of undermines what's going on in Ruth, which is everyone behaving well and according to, what they're supposed to be doing, with the exception of one guy who shall quite literally remain nameless.
That's right. Right. The unsandaled one.
Yeah.
When we think about the book of Ruth, just to step back, before, it's so easy to get into. It's a short book with so many clear characters, really easy to get into. When we step back and think about the book as a whole, what's it about? Which is to say, I know lots of times the book of Ruth comes up in contemporary conversation, about conversion, right? This is, the lines or it's a marriage book, right?
What does it mean to join Israel? Right? Or what does it mean to become part of a nation, right? Conversion is a really anachronistic way, actually. I mean, I would say, of thinking about the work, because the work is about, it's about many things, but it's about patriarchal norms and the kind of very extremely subtle subversion of those norms through the figure of Naomi becoming patriarch, in effect, and Ruth the Moabitess joining her family. It's not about when Ruth gives her statement of devotion, which is, I think it's read in a lot of
weddings. All the weddings.
All the weddings. And it's actually like a beautiful statement of devotion. So I think it actually has a really appropriate place in weddings in that sense. As a statement of conversion and faith, I don't think that that's what it's about. I think it's about Ruth stating that she will be Naomi's son and Naomi as her father.
So less conversion, more adoption.
Yeah, that's a really concise way of putting it.
I mean, but so let me ask this: when we think about, I mean, what you just sort of identified as the core moment of the story, it's like that's the very beginning of the story. That you've not mentioned like any of the. I mean, any of like the stuff with Boaz and the like the movie. That's all the stuff that happened. That's like preamble.
Yeah.
Which is funny because, of course, for a marriage, like for the weddings, there is a wedding that happens in the book of Ruth, but it's not the quote from the wedding that gets used in weddings.
Right, which is, from a perspective of, biblical marriage, it is quite a bizarre way of adopting that phrase, but I digress. Mm-hmm. So I think what is really interesting about Ruth and the way it's structured as a story is that the crisis arises at the beginning and is almost seemingly resolved at the beginning with Ruth's statement of devotion to Naomi. And I think what a reader sort of uncovers as one goes through the story is that actually that's not resolved, right? Because the real issue at hand is future generations. It's about the land, right? It's about an heir. So in many senses, this story is borrowing from lots of different biblical texts and reflecting on them, not in name, sometimes specifically in phrases, right? But also making subtle changes in doing so. So an example of this would be borrowing some of the plot elements from Genesis 38, the story of Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar. A very unorthodox relationship between,
to say the least,
between father-in-law and daughter-in-law. But in that story, that's a story about how to save the name and the family line after the death of the firstborn son. And so Tamar, being the wife of the firstborn, she is not able to perpetuate his line, his name, with an heir. And long story short, ends up doing so with his father. Mm-hmm. In the story of Ruth, we have a kind of weird combo of the need for the name to be perpetuated, but also the need for the land to be redeemed.
But because whose name is it? We barely know anybody's name.
I mean, all the men are dead at the beginning of the story.
Right. I mean, they're even named things like disease.
And death, right? Machlon and Kilion.
Yeah.
Well, the father's name is Elimelech, which one could spend a lot of time sort of ruminating about what reverberations that has. But let's focus on this idea of the name, because the name is the perpetuation of the name is a really important feature of Genesis 38, of the story of Judah and Tamar. It is also in Ruth, but Ruth is also sort of overlaid with this story of return. So if we could talk a little bit about the date of Ruth, that might be an interesting way into understanding what this story is doing. Now, as we said before, in the Christian Bibles, it follows the book of Judges. What do you think about its date of, and I'm not going to ask you for putting a date on composition, but should we take seriously situating this work within the period of the Judges?
No.
And why?
I mean, actually, for some of the reasons that you already suggested, which is it is so, I think, very openly it like very openly is borrowing from other texts. It's commenting on. In a sense, Ruth is one of the few, or maybe even one of the first biblical texts that seems to be very consciously trying to figure out what to do with the multiplicity of earlier biblical texts. Like, how do I read these things together? And so you get, we'll maybe talk about it in the next session, but you get, the very weird levirate marriage ceremony, which seems to be like a text trying to figure out how that was, what anyone really meant by that. When you get like this weird like brother-in-law wedding thing. So that's one aspect, and the other is, for those of us who sort of have a sense of biblical Hebrew as not being monolithic, but having early forms of the language and late forms of the language, in the same way that English has, like, we know that Chaucer and Shakespeare and contemporary English all look different. Ruth's language tilts late.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's really evocative of a kind of fantasy of the past. And that's one of the really interesting features of how the story is constructed, because it is framed as being set within the period of the judges, but it also uses myriad of phrases that one would find in texts that tell of the past, right? And so it's a story of return to the land, return from Moab to Judah, right? But it's a story of return that's like returning to an earlier time. So that's one sort of, like, to me, that's one of the like motifs of return to the past.
Do you think that comes out of a historical context in which the present was like a little not so good, and the past was being valorized as, like, in this sort of pastoral, like, everything was good back then sort of sense?
If so, it would be very unusual to try to draw upon the period of the judges as a beautiful, idyllic past. Maybe it's doing so as a corrective. Like, again, these are not answers that I have, just ways of thinking about the text, right? The Judges is a very strange choice for thinking about an idyllic past, but maybe that's meant very heavy-handedly as a corrective.
Also, though, and I think I want to end here this session, but the setting of it in the Judges allows it to do maybe its most like prominent appeal to the past, which is the end in which Ruth is the ancestor of David. I suspect that is a later addition to the Book of Ruth that's sort of meant to be like, what is this story doing in here?
But it beautifully links up to the genealogy at the end of Genesis 38. So as a way of explicitly dealing with biblical texts, it's not only slotting itself in at the beginning with setting itself in the time of the Judges, it's also continuing a continuous narrative history in doing that. So yes, it is making kind of historiographical moves, but it's also very transparently, at least from my perspective, historical fiction.